Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, it's arguably one of the most complex we've ever tackled, unpacking the incredible structure of Indian society.
It really is immense.
Yeah, we're moving well beyond just simple geographical labels. We want to explore its layered history, from those early colonial attempts to classify people physically.
The anthropometrics.
Exactly. All the way to the deep philosophical foundations. The ideas about duty, life, death, and then right through to its dynamic modern evolution, especially demographically.
And when you look at India, the sheer scale of variation, in language, customs, economic life, belief systems, it can feel overwhelming, can't it?
Absolutely.
It's a place where, 3,000-year-old concepts like spiritual debt exist right alongside cutting-edge space programs. So our goal today is really to provide you with a kind of blueprint.
A blueprint, oh.
A synthesized understanding of the key forces, anthropological, demographic, social, cultural. We're trying to give you the why and the how behind this huge variation, and importantly, the rapid shifts you see happening across the subcontinent.
Okay, so where do we start with this massive journey? Maybe with the core concept.
Let's start with ethnicity. It's foundational.
Right, it's a term people use a lot, maybe sometimes a bit loosely.
Exactly. At its heart, ethnicity refers to socially constructed groups. The key is socially constructed. Members share things like common ancestry, certain biological traits, which could be physical markers or genetics and cultural traits.
Like language, customs, ritual.
Precisely. It's fundamentally built on a shared sense of identity. And that identity might come from birthplace, religion, nationality. It's complex, multifaceted, and it plays a huge role in shaping how we see human variation.
Okay, so understanding that ethnicity is socially constructed. That seems crucial for looking back at how people tried to classify Indians historically.
It becomes immediately important, yes. If our challenge today is synthesizing complexity, the challenge for, say, colonial administrators was just trying to map it, to put it into boxes.
Which takes us straight into that legacy of colonial attempts heavily based on anthropometric data.
Ah, the measuring tapes and calipers?
Yeah, trying to categorize entire populations just based on physical measurements. It seems almost absurd now, doesn't it?
It does. Imagine trying to capture that whole spectrum of human diversity with just those tools.
So who were the key figures in this effort?
Well, one of the earliest, and certainly one we remember historically, was H. Risley. His 1915 classification aimed to identify distinct racial types.
And his goal wasn't just description, right? It was about origins.
Exactly. He wanted to establish origins and relationships, linking physical traits to historical migrations, all based on these superficial, measurable proxies.
Trying to fit everyone into these neat, identifiable boxes based on traits we now know are, well, pretty poor indicators of actual genetic lineage.
Very poor.
Let's take one of his examples, like the Turco-Iranian type. What did that involve?
Risley's description was incredibly specific, almost granular. He defined this type by broad heads, tall stature, fine to medium noses, fair complexion. But what's really fascinating and shows the mindset is his focus on details like abundant facial and body hair. He genuinely believed these traits were the result of intermingling between Turkey and Persian elements.
Yeah, he's tracing history through skull shapes and beards.
Pretty much. And the people living in what was then the northwest frontier provinces in Baluchistan, it really highlights that colonial drive to map and categorize based on physical appearance.
So Risley, in 1915, qualitative, broad racial types. Then came the 1931 census of India, led by B.S. Guha. Did things get more, let's say, scientific?
It was definitely more systematic. Guha's approach was much more elaborate. He moved past just general types. He collected data on a huge number, 38 different physical characteristics.
38? Wow.
Yeah, and he used statistical methods like 63 coefficients of racial likeness to try and classify the population. His conclusion divided people into 6 major racial strains and 9 subtypes.
That sounds incredibly detailed. What were some examples of the types Guha identified? Maybe some contrasting ones.
He really covered a wide spectrum. At one end, he identified what he called the Negrito type.
Okay.
Characterized by dark skin, pygmy-like features, spirally curved hair, thick lips. He pointed to isolated groups like the Kadars and Yarulas in South India as examples.
And at the other end?
He classified the Mediterranean type. He linked this group directly to the builders of the ancient Indus Valley civilization.
Oh, interesting connection.
Yeah. Defined by long to medium tall stature, lighter complexion. He found examples in places like Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Bengal, even mentioning specific groups like the Nambudiri Brahmins of Cochin.
So Guha goes for hyper-detail with 38 characteristics, but then later SS Sarkar seems to simplify things again, focusing on just one measurement.
That's right. Sarkar shifted the focus, championing the cephalic index, basically. The width-length ratio of the skull is the primary marker for distinguishing groups.
Just the head shape,
Primarily, he divided populations into dolichocephals, meaning long-headed.
which included groups like Indo-Aryans and Mundari speakers.
Yes. And brachycephals, meaning short-headed.
And these brachycephals, the short-headed groups, he linked them to different origins, perhaps later migrations.
Often, yes. Linked to elements from Central Asia or Southeast Asia, sometimes characterized by different traits like yellowish skin tones or sparser facial hair, distinguishing them from, say, the Indo-Aryan groups.
Okay, so we've got Risley, Guha, Sarkar,
Yeah.
all these attempts to classify. But what's the critical perspective now? Why are these systems considered obsolete?
Well, the modern scientific consensus is pretty clear. These classifications fundamentally fail because they drastically oversimplify continuous genetic diversity.
Right, human genetics just doesn't fit into neat boxes.
Exactly. Genetic variation is continuous, not discrete. There aren't sharp lines between these supposed racial categories that you can measure with a caliper.
And we have to talk about the historical context too, right? The baggage these systems carried.
Absolutely crucial. These systems were often deeply embedded in colonial ideologies and ethnocentrism. They were sometimes used, implicitly or explicitly, to justify or enforce perceived social hierarchies.
And modern genetics basically blows this apart.
Completely. Modern genetic research consistently shows that there's far more genetic diversity within any one of these historically defined populations than there is between them.
It's actually amazing to think how much of, well, modern history and policy was shaped by this flawed race-based science built essentially on measuring skulls.
It's a sobering thought.
Okay, so if classifying the Indian body was the first challenge for outsiders, understanding the Indian soul, the philosophical underpinnings, that's the next huge area.
It really is. The deep philosophical accounting system that governs duty, consequence, life itself. Let's dive into those foundations now.
And this really has to start with the concept of Purushartha, doesn't it? The four aims of life.
Yes. The four fundamental aims or goals of human life, traditionally associated with Hinduism, it's essentially a framework for a purposeful existence. It dictates ethical priorities throughout life.
So what are the four aims?
Okay, first and foundational is dharma. This means righteousness, duty, ethical conduct. It's about your moral obligations based on your role and stage in life.
The ethical bedrock.
Precisely. Second is artha. This is material prosperity, wealth, economic well-being. But, and this is critical, it must be acquired through means that align with dharma.
Ah, so you can't just chase wealth unethically. It has to be righteous wealth.
Exactly. The means justify the end, or rather, they must align. Third is kama.
Pleasure, enjoyment.
Sensual and aesthetic pleasures, enjoyment, love, yes. This is explicitly recognized as a legitimate human pursuit.
Right.
But again, there's a boundary. It must be contained within the limits set by dharma.
Duty always frames pleasure and prosperity.
It does. And finally, the ultimate goal, the one that transcends all these worldly pursuits, is moksha.
Liberation.
Liberation, spiritual freedom from the cycle of birth and rebirth, the ultimate release.
So you have these four aims. Duty, wealth, pleasure, liberation. They often seem like they could conflict, right? How does the philosophy guide people in balancing them?
The balance is key. And it's achieved largely through the concept of the ashramas, or the stages of life. The life stages.
Right. So during the householder stage, the grahastha ashrama, the focus is heavily on balancing dharma, artha, and kama, fulfilling duties, raising a family, achieving legitimate success and enjoyment.
Makes sense.
But as a person moves into the later stages, like the forest dweller or renunciate stages, the emphasis shifts, often overwhelmingly, towards achieving moksha. So the framework provides a kind of evolving moral compass.
Okay, and that ethical framework, that sense of duty and ultimate goals, it connects directly to karma, rina, and rebirth, samsara, doesn't it? This whole cosmic accounting system.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected. Karma is that universal law of cause and effect, of consequence.
Actions have reactions.
Every action, even thoughts and intentions, creates an imprint, a kind of energy, positive or negative. And this imprint determines your future circumstances, maybe later in this life, but definitely in future lives.
And this ties into rina, this idea of debt. How does that work? Karma is the general law, but Rina refers to specific debts or obligations that you accumulate during life. These aren't financial debts, but sort of moral or existential ones that need to be settled or repaid.
So, if karma shapes your next life, Rina is about balancing the books in this life. Or does repaying Rina improve your karma?
It's more about immediate obligation and reciprocity, ensuring balance. Repaying these debts is considered part of fulfilling one's dharma, which naturally contributes to good karma. But Rina itself is about acknowledging what you owe. The philosophy details 4 crucial types of Rina.
Okay, let's break those down. They sound really comprehensive.
They are, first, there's Buddha Rina, the debt you owe to all beings, animals, plants, the natural world,
How do you repay that?
through stewardship, respect for nature, often nonviolence or ahimsa. Then there's Divarina, the debt owed to the deities, the divine forces.
Repaid through worship.
Worship, rituals, gratitude for the blessings received, for the cosmic order they maintain. Third is Rishirina.
The debt to the sages.
Yes, to the ancient sages and wise ones who preserved and transmitted knowledge, the scriptures, the wisdom traditions. You repay this debt by studying, learning, teaching, and passing on that knowledge.
Preserving the intellectual heritage.
Exactly. And finally, perhaps the most socially potent one, Piturina.
The debt to the ancestors.
Yes, the debt to your forefathers, your ancestors, for your very existence, your lineage, the opportunities you inherited from them.
And how is that repaid? This sounds crucial for family structure.
Traditionally, it's repaid primarily through raising progeny, continuing the family line, and performing specific rituals and ceremonies, like Shraddha, to honor the souls of the departed ancestors.
Wow. You can see how that would create huge social pressure, right? To marry, have children, maintain the line, remember the ancestors.
Immense pressure. It shapes decisions about marriage, family size, inheritance, even today, deeply embedding the family unit within this cosmic obligation.
So it's this profound moral accountability system. But if you accumulate karma and Rina, you're still stuck, right? Stuck in the cycle.
You remain bound to samsara, the continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This cycle, with all its suffering and limitations, continues until the soul finally achieves moksha, breaking free entirely.
Okay, so these deep philosophical ideas, dharma, karma, Rina, moksha, how do they manifest on the ground, socially? This must bring us to the caste system.
It inevitably does, and to understand the lived reality, we absolutely have to distinguish between the theory and the practice. Varna versus Jati.
Right, Varna is the theory, the ancient textual model.
Yes, the fourfold division you find in texts like the Vedas: Brahmins, priests, scholars; Kshatriyas, warriors, rulers; Vaishyas, merchants, farmers; and Shudras, laborers, service providers. Texts sometimes suggested this was based on aptitude or function, maybe even theoretically fluid.
But the reality on the ground is jati.
Exactly. Jati, often translated as caste, is the operational reality. Jatis are typically rigid, endogamous groups, meaning you marry within your jati. They're determined by birth.
And characterized by hierarchy.
Strict hierarchy, yes. Restrictions on social interaction, especially around food and drink, that's commensality. And often hereditary occupation, though that's become more flexible over time.
This seems like a perfect place to bring in that key anthropological distinction. The book view versus the field view.
Ah, yes. This is absolutely essential for understanding power and reality in India.
So the book view, that's the textual idealized version, like from the scripture.
Precisely. Often associated with structuralist thinkers like Louis Dumont, the book view emphasizes the ideological structure derived from sacred texts. For Dumont, the fundamental organizing principle of the caste system was this deep binary hierarchy based on purity and pollution.
Purity and pollution. Explain that a bit more.
The idea is that higher castes maintain ritual purity by avoiding contact with substances, activities, or even people deemed ritually polluting things associated with death, bodily emissions, certain occupations like leatherwork or handling waste. This avoidance maintains their higher ritual status.
So the books say ritual purity dictates the hierarchy, and it's fixed. But then you get the field view. People like Emma and Srinivas actually going into villages.
And seeing what really happens, Srinivas's work, particularly in villages like Rampura, highlighted the actual power dynamics on the ground. This is the field view.
And what did he find? Did purity always win?
Not at all. That's the crux. Srinivas found that local economic and political power often trumped ritual status. He developed the concept of the dominant caste.
Dominant caste.
This might be a caste like peasants, who technically had a lower Varna status, say Shudra, but if they owned most of the land, controlled the village council, had numerical strength, and could command labor, they held the actual power locally.
So the local landowner, even if ritually lower, could boss around a ritually higher but impoverished Brahmin.
Absolutely. The dominant caste could exert social, economic, and political control regardless of their theoretical position in the Varna scheme.
So is India then this constant tension between the ideological should of ritual status from the book view and the practical is of economic and political power from the field view?
That's a great way to put it. The ideological framework described by Dumont provides the normative code, the language of hierarchy. But the lived experience, as shown by Srinivas, reveals that power, wealth, land ownership, and local influence often dictate the reality of caste interactions, frequently bending or even ignoring the strict ritual norms.
It's this dynamic tension
Yeah,
that defines how the system actually works and adapts locally.
exactly. It explains its resilience and its capacity for localized change, even while the overall structure seems persistent.
Okay, let's shift gears now. From social structure and philosophy to something that impacts everything globally, population dynamics. This takes us into Section 3, population dynamics and demographic transition in India.
Right. And when we talk about India today, population is unavoidable. We're talking about a unique and truly massive population structure. It defines modern India.
And the defining feature is youth.
Overwhelmingly. We're talking about the structure of a young nation. If you picture that standard age-sex pyramid graph,
Yeah, wider at the bottom, tapering at the top.
for India, historically and still largely, it's got a very wide base. That wide base means an expansive population and a major youth bulge.
How big a boulder are we talking?
The data from the 2011 census was striking. At that time, 41% of the total population was below 20 years old,
41%.
and 64%, nearly two-thirds, was below 30. That's an enormous concentration of young people.
But you mentioned regional differences earlier. This youth bulge isn't uniform across the entire country, is it?
Not at all. There's massive regional variation. States like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, they have significantly higher population densities and much larger, more expansive youth populations. Their pyramids still have that very wide base.
And the contrast.
States like Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south, they're much further along in their demographic transition. Their populations are relatively older, fertility rates are lower, and they're nearing demographic stabilization. Their pyramids are starting to narrow at the bottom, becoming more rectangular.
So these regional differences clearly show the country is in a state of demographic transition. We can actually measure this shift, right, using birth and death rates.
Yes, the data shows clear movement. Looking at the period from 2000 to 2019, for instance,
What happened?
the crude birth rate, CBR, that's the number of live births per 1,000 people per year, it dropped substantially, from 28.2 down to 19.0.
That's a big drop.
It is. And similarly, the crude death rate, CDR, deaths per 1,000 people, also dropped, from 8.6 to 6.3.
So fewer births, fewer deaths. What does that signify overall?
It indicates improving life expectancy, definitely better healthcare and sanitation, leading to lower death rates, and crucially, a reduction in average family size, driving down the birth rate.
What are the main factors pushing that birth rate down? Why are people having fewer children?
The biggest drivers are socioeconomic. Increased education levels, especially for women, is huge.
How does women's education impact it?
Better educated women tend to marry later, have greater autonomy in reproductive choices, and often desire smaller families. So women's empowerment is a key factor.
Makes sense.
Then there are major improvements in public health, disease control, better access to healthcare. This drastically reduces infant and child mortality.
Which means parents don't feel the need to have extra children just in case some don't survive.
Exactly. That perceived need diminishes. And of course, government family planning programs and increased access to contraception have also played a significant role.
But it's not all smooth sailing, is it? These positive trends are often slowed down by deeply ingrained sociocultural factors.
Definitely. The preference for larger families, though weakening, still persists in many communities. And then there's the pervasive issue of son preference.
The desire for male children. How does that impact demographics?
It can lead to skewed sex ratios at birth, sometimes due to sex-selective practices, unfortunately. It also puts pressure on couples to keep having children until a desired number of sons is achieved.
And early marriage.
That's another major factor highlighted in studies like the 2020 State of World Population Report. Early marriage leads to early childbearing, and women who start having children earlier tend to have larger families overall. This sustains population pressure, particularly in certain regions.
This whole story of population change, especially the government's role, it has a very difficult history in India, doesn't it? We need to talk about the population policy history.
Yes, it's a history with some very dark chapters. India was actually one of the first developing nations to launch a state-sponsored family planning program way back between 1951 and 1974.
How did that initial phase go?
Initially, the efforts were quite ad hoc, based on voluntary participation and relatively limited in effectiveness. Clinic-based, not very wide reach.
But then came the emergency period, 1976-77. Things changed dramatically.
Dramatically and dangerously. Under Indira Gandhi's emergency rule, the government shifted to an incredibly aggressive, target-driven approach. The focus became almost entirely on sterilization, often coercive, as the primary method to curb population growth rapidly.
Coercive sterilization. How widespread was this?
The numbers are shocking. The sources point to a peak of 8.1 million sterilizations performed during that single period, 1976-77.
8 million.
And a huge number of these were forced or highly coercive, often targeting poor men in mass camps. It was a human rights disaster.
What was the fallout from that? Politically, socially?
Catastrophic. It created widespread fear, deep public resentment, and fundamentally damaged trust in government health initiatives for years. Politically, it was a major factor in the Congress Party's massive defeat in the elections following the emergency.
So a hard lesson learned about coercion.
A very hard lesson. It effectively made mass sterilization politically untouchable for any government for a very long time. Coercion, even for national goals, proved to be political suicide.
Which brings us to the modern approach. The National Population Policy, NPP, of 2000 seems to mark a turning point.
Absolutely. The NPP 2000 represented a complete shift away from targets and coercion. The emphasis now is firmly on voluntary and informed choice.
Integrated with health services.
Yes, integrating family planning seamlessly into broader reproductive and child health services, making it part of overall well-being, not a standalone population control measure.
Are there specific programs driving this now?
A key current initiative is Mission Parivar Vikas, MPV. It specifically targets 13 states with high fertility rates, mostly in North India.
What does it do?
It focuses on expanding access to a wider range of contraceptive methods, improving service delivery, and promoting family planning through information and counseling. The basket of choices has expanded significantly.
Right.
Things like the injectable contraceptive, Antara, and the non-hormonal weekly pill, Centromin, are now part of the public health system offering. It signals a complete move away from the aggressive, single-method focus of the past towards choice and empowerment.
Okay, so we've looked at population growth and policy. Now let's look at social movement within the society. How does it change and adapt? This is section 4, the mechanics of sociocultural change. Let's start with the main indigenous mechanism for change, Sanskritization.
Right, Sanskritization. This is M.N. Srinivas's key concept, explaining how upward social mobility traditionally occurred within the Hindu caste structure.
So how does it work? What's the process?
It describes the process where a lower-ranked Hindu caste, or sometimes even a tribal group outside the main Hindu fold, tries to improve its social standing.
By copying higher castes.
Essentially, yes. By adopting the customs, rituals, dietary habits like becoming vegetarian lifestyle, and sometimes even the ideology of a higher-ranking caste, usually a locally dominant twice-born caste, often Brahmins.
So it's emulation. You act higher, hoping to eventually be accepted as higher.
That's the goal. Over a generation or two, the hope is that the local community will grant them a higher status in the local hierarchy.
And Srinivas had a specific way of describing the effect of this, right? It wasn't changing the whole system.
Exactly. He stressed that Sanskritization leads to positional changes, meaning a specific caste might move up a rung or two on the local ladder, improving its status relative to its neighbors, but it does not lead to structural change. The overall hierarchical structure of the caste system, the ladder itself, remains intact. Only the relative positions of some groups on the ladder might shift. The system itself endures.
Now, this leads to a really interesting modern paradox, doesn't it? Especially with government reservation policies.
Yes, the sources point this out clearly. Reservation policies, which provide affirmative action benefits like quotas in education and government jobs for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes, they create an inherent tension with the process of Sanskritization. Well, to access these state-provided benefits, individuals and groups need to be officially recognized under these categories. This creates a strong incentive for beneficiaries to actively maintain and assert their Dalit or scheduled caste tribe identity.
Ah, so the very identity that Sanskritization aimed to shed or move beyond is now politically and economically valuable.
Precisely. If you achieve success, maybe through education gained via reservation, you're simultaneously rewarded for holding on to the disadvantaged label that grants access to those resources. This runs directly counter to the traditional emulative goal of Sanskritization, which was about claiming higher ritual status and distancing oneself from lower status associations.
So the modern state, in trying to uplift, might actually be kind of freezing the traditional hierarchy in a new way by linking mobility to maintaining that lower status identity.
It creates a complex dynamic. You could argue it that way. The incentives of the traditional ritual system, gain status by emulating the pure, clash directly with the incentives of the modern bureaucratic system, gain resources by claiming disadvantaged status. People face choices about which form of capital ritual or political to prioritize.
Fascinating. Okay, alongside this internal dynamic, there's the massive external force, Westernization.
Yes, the other major engine of change identified by Srinivas. He defined Westernization broadly as the profound changes brought into Indian society and culture due to over 150 years of British rule.
And this wasn't just about technology, right?
No, it permeated everything. Technology, yes, but also institutions like law, administration, education, ideology, values.
What was the key ideological impact?
A major one was the introduction of modern Western-style education. This exposed the Indian intelligentsia to European ideas, liberty, equality, human rights, rationalism, humanism ideas from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the major revolutions.
And this had a dual effect.
Yes. On one hand, it fostered humanitarian ideals among Indian social reformers. It raised awareness and spurred movements against social evils prevalent at the time. Like sati, widow immolation, untouchability, child marriage, reformers used these Western ideals to critique their own society.
And the other effect.
Crucially, it equipped Indian nationalist leaders with the intellectual tools, the vocabulary of liberty and self-determination that they needed to argue for and ultimately fight for independence from British rule itself. It was a double-edged sword for the colonizers.
So internal change through Sanskritization, external change through Westernization. There's one more layer of cultural dynamics we need to cover, the interaction between different levels of tradition.
Right, the interplay between what anthropologists Robert Redfield and McKim Marriott called the Great Tradition and the Little Tradition.
Okay, define those. What's the great tradition?
The Great Tradition refers to the more formalized, standardized, often elite or scriptural practices and beliefs. Think of the Vedas, classical Sanskrit literature, major deities recognized across large regions, pan-Indian philosophical concepts. It's often literate and reflects a certain orthodoxy.
And the little tradition.
The Little Tradition is the opposite. It's local, often village-based, folk beliefs, customs, deities, and rituals. It's usually transmitted orally, highly localized, and specific to particular communities. Think local village gods or spirits, unique festival variations.
And Marriott argued these aren't separate. They interact.
Constantly. He described two key processes of interaction. The first is universalization.
Universalization going up.
Exactly. This is the upward movement where an element from the little tradition, a local deity, a folk practice, a story gets absorbed, standardized, and integrated into the broader great tradition. It gains wider recognition and legitimacy.
Will you give an example?
A classic example Marriott used was a local village goddess, maybe called Sarti, worshipped for prosperity in just one area. Over time, she might become identified with and eventually absorbed into the universally recognized Hindu goddess Lakshmi, the pan-Indian goddess of wealth. The local element gets universalized.
Okay, so that's upward movement. What about the other way?
That's parochialization, the downward movement.
Great tradition elements becoming localized.
Precisely. This is when elements from the great tradition, a festival, a deity, a scriptural story, are adopted at the local level, but they get integrated and adapted to fit specific local customs and contexts. Sometimes they lose their original complexity or meaning in the process.
An example of parochialization.
Marriott studied a village called Kishan Garhi. He found that the great Hindu festival of Navaratri, traditionally a nine-night worship of the goddess, was celebrated locally, but it became focused almost entirely on a single, simplified mud deity called Northa, worshipped for those 9 nights.
Northa. That
Yeah.
sounds like a local version of Navaratri.
Exactly. The name Northa itself is likely a parochialized, localized contraction of the Sanskrit Navaratra, 9 nights. The Great Tradition Festival was adopted but transformed into a distinct little tradition practice. This constant back and forth universalization and parochialization ensures that culture is always dynamic, a two-way street between the local and the universal.
This brings us perfectly to our final section. All these forces, historical classifications, philosophical systems, demographic shifts, social and cultural change mechanisms, they result in incredible diversity on the ground. Let's look at linguistic and religious diversity, focusing specifically on minority groups.
Right, because understanding the status and challenges of minorities really illuminates the complexities of the Indian social fabric.
Let's start with linguistic minorities. How are they defined to India?
Basically, these are groups whose mother tongue is different from the main regional language of the state or area they live in. India is hugely multilingual, so nearly every state has linguistic minorities.
And the Constitution protects them.
Yes, the Constitution guarantees their right to conserve their distinct language and culture, particularly the right to have primary education in their mother tongue, at least in principle.
What's the main challenge they face in reality?
The core challenge is often practical. Getting access to quality education and resources in their native language, especially beyond the primary level. There's always a risk of cultural assimilation and language extinction due to the dominance of the major regional language in administration, higher education, media, and the job market.
Okay, now let's turn to religious minorities. We should use some specific data here to make it concrete. Let's start with Muslims, the largest minority group.
Right, Muslims constitute about 14.2% of India's population. The data highlights some significant socioeconomic challenges for the community as a whole.
Such as?
Literacy rates tend to be lower than the national average, around 60%, according to some sources mentioned. Poverty rates are relatively high, with figures suggesting around 43% living below the poverty line.
And what about social structure? Islam theoretically rejects caste.
Theoretically, yes. Islam preaches equality. However, on the ground, particularly in South Asia, social stratification strongly resembling the caste system often persists among Muslim communities. You find endogamous groups, sometimes referred to by caste-like names, biradaris, and even traditional caste panchayats or councils that regulate social norms within these groups.
And representation in public life.
That's another area of concern often highlighted. Representation in government jobs, police forces, and elected political office tends to be disproportionately low compared to their population share, often cited as less than 5% in many sectors.
Okay, moving to Christians, a smaller minority.
Yes, about 2.3% of the population. They're concentrated geographically heavily in the southern states like Kerala, Goa, Tamil Nadu, but also significantly in the northeast.
What's a key sociological point about Christians in India, similar to the Muslims in caste?
It's the persistence of pre-conversion social status. While Christianity also preaches equality, in many communities, caste distinctions do persist based on the caste the family or group belonged to before converting.
So you might have social distinctions between, say, Brahmin Christians and Dalit Christians.
Yes, unfortunately, that social stratification can carry over, affecting marriage patterns and social interactions within the Christian community itself.
But Christians have had a major impact in certain sectors, right?
Absolutely. Christian-run institutions have historically dominated and continue to be very prominent in key service sectors, particularly education, schools, colleges, and healthcare, hospitals, clinics. This has been a significant avenue for social mobility, not just for Christians, but for many communities accessing these services.
Next, the Jains. Even smaller, but economically significant.
Yes, Jains make up only about 0.4% of the population. They were officially granted minority religion status relatively recently in 2014.
What are their key characteristics?
Demographically, they are highly urbanized. About 70% live in cities and towns. They have an exceptionally high literacy rate, around 94%. And occupationally, they are overwhelmingly concentrated in trade, business, and commerce.
Are there specific social issues within the Jain community highlighted in the sources?
Yes, two stand out. One is a skewed gender ratio, often attributed to gender-selective practices similar to those seen in some other affluent communities. The other is an extremely low female work participation rate.
How low?
Remarkably low, cited at only around 9%.
Why would it be so low, especially with such high literacy?
It's often linked to sociocultural factors within this traditionally affluent trading community. High levels of family wealth may reduce the economic necessity for women to work outside the home, reinforcing traditional gender roles where women focus on household management, religious observance, and community activities.
Hmm. Interesting dynamic. Okay, our final spotlight.
Hmm.
The smallest minority discussed. The Parsis or Zoroastrians.
Tiny group, less than 0.05% of the population now. Descendants of Zoroastrians who emigrated from Persia centuries ago.
And their profile.
Highly urbanized, very high literacy rates, economically prosperous, and historically they've made immense contributions to Indian industry, science, and philanthropy, way out of proportion to their numbers.
But they face a critical challenge.
An existential one.
Severe declining population.
Yeah.
Why?
It's due to a combination of factors common in highly educated, urbanized groups globally, but perhaps more extreme here. Late marriages, a high proportion never marrying, and very low birth rates when they do marry. The community is shrinking rapidly.
To the point where the government is stepping in.
Yes, it's quite unique. The Indian government launched a specific scheme called Geo Parsi, Live Parsi, aimed explicitly at encouraging Parsis to have more children, providing financial support for fertility treatments, and promoting earlier marriage, all in an effort to prevent the community's demographic decline and potential cultural extinction.
Wow, what a journey. We've gone from colonial calipers measuring heads
Right back at the start.
through these profound ideas of spiritual debt like Rina, the cycle of karma, the complexities of Varna versus Jati, then the huge demographic shifts, the youth bulge, the fraught history of population policy, and finally these mechanisms of change like Sanskritization and the constant dance between great and little traditions.
It really covers a vast terrain. And the final takeaway for you, the listener, I think, is this. The remarkable strength and complexity of Indian society lies in how all these forces coexist, often in tension, often contradicting each other.
You mean tradition and modernity bumping up against each other?
Exactly. You see rigid traditional principles like Jati hierarchy existing alongside and being challenged by the modern economic power of a dominant caste or the individual aspirations fueled by westernization. The categories we use, Varna, Jati, purity, pollution, they're always being contested and negotiated in the lived reality, the field view.
And change is constant.
Absolutely constant. Driven from within by things like Sanskritization and from without by forces like westernization and globalization. And that interplay between the universal and the local, the great and little traditions, means culture is always evolving.
So we ended section 3 talking about that massive youth bulge.
Yeah.
The 2021 data suggesting 53.6% of the population was under 29.
Yes. And this really creates a critical inflection point for India's future. This is the famous demographic dividend.
The window of opportunity.
Precisely, a period where you have a potentially huge workforce relative to the number of dependents, children and elderly. The challenge for India is no longer primarily about controlling population size, but about harnessing this massive potential advantage.
How? What needs to happen?
It requires massive, focused investment in human capital. Upgrading skill sets is paramount: vocational skills, technical skills, digital literacy for this enormous young generation entering the workforce, and continuing to prioritize women's education is absolutely critical as it unlocks so much potential.
But we also talked about huge regional variations. The South is aging faster. The North has the bigger youth bulge. Does this create an internal challenge for exploiting that dividend?
That's the crucial provocative thought, isn't it? How does a diverse country manage this uneven transition? Will the older, perhaps more developed southern states with better infrastructure and human development indicators need to significantly support the education, health, and job creation needs of the massive youth populations in the northern states?
A potential source of friction or a necessity for national progress.
It's the ultimate test of modern Indian federalism and social policy. If this youth bulge isn't educated, skilled, and employed effectively across the entire nation, it risks transforming from a potential dividend into a demographic bomb, a massive cohort of underemployed, potentially disaffected young people.
So ensuring this bulge becomes productive rather than a burden, that truly tests the synthesis of all the traditional structures and modern challenges we've discussed.
It really does. It demands understanding how these indigenous obligations, social structures, and exogenous forces interact in the context of today's demographic reality.
A challenge that definitely invites further thought. That's where we'll leave our deep dive for today.